Even if the creatures of the Grixis Death Shadow archetype may seem very heavy in interactions and rules, I believe the true complexity of this deck lies in the lands and non-creature spells used in it. On this video, we're gonna try to explain how to make the best use of these cards and how to handle some interactions that might come up. Firstly, we'll expose some basic information about the fetch lands, shock lands, and the occasional horizon land that may be used in the metabase. Without a doubt, the most important of this deck's lands are the fetches. All of them have an activated ability that reads like the one on Scouting Tarn here. Tap, pay 1 life, sacrifice Scouting Tarn, search your library for an island or mountain card, and put it on the battlefield, then shuffle your library. With that in mind, let us analyze the utility of fetch lands by segmenting all of the relevant parts of their ability. First, you need to tap a fetch land in order to use its activated ability. So, cards that make the fetches enter the battlefield tapped will prevent you from using their full effect until you manage to untap them. Second, you have to pay 1 life. This is crucial if you're playing a shadow deck, since your objective is to lose a set amount of life as quickly as possible in order to enable your big beaters in the early turns of the game. Remember, if you're at 0 life and for some reason have not lost the game, you can't pay the life cost of this activated ability. Third, by sacrificing a fetch land to its activated ability, you fill your graveyard and hasten the casting of spells with abilities like Delve and Escape. This effect cannot be underestimated, as it enables powerful spells like Gurmag Angler as soon as turn 1 with the right cards in hand, even though it's very unlikely and depends on a lot of luck. Also, cards like Fatal Push care about any permanents leaving the battlefield, so you can save one of the fetches until a crucial moment where you need the Revolt to destroy a creature with higher converted mana cost. Fourth, note that the fetch lands allow you to search for lands with 2 basic land types, but they do not have to be basic lands themselves. So, as long as the card you're searching for is either an island or mountain, in Scouting Tarn's case, you may fetch it and put it onto the battlefield. And the ability doesn't put the land on the battlefield tapped, so some lands might enter untapped when you fetch them. Fifth, by shuffling your library and grabbing a land card out of it, you not only thin your deck, but you can take an unwanted card out of the top of your library and hope to draw something better instead. Fetch lands are the lifeblood of this deck. They not only enable so much of the deck's threats, but also allow you to have a consistent form of access to all 3 colors of mana used by this archetype with ease. Remember, fetch lands do not produce mana under normal circumstances, and their activated ability is not a mana ability, so it uses this stack and can be responded to before resolving, can be countered by something like Stifle, or outright prevented by effects like that of Pithing Needle. Some effects, like the one on Ashiok Dreamrender, will not actually prevent you from activating abilities like the one on the fetches, but you will not be able to find anything because it's prevented by the Planeswalker in this case. You will still tap, sacrifice the land, and pay 1 life. You just won't find anything, and your opponent has no moral obligation to let you go back on your play, so stay sharp. Try and keep those details in mind, because when your opponents can't just prevent or counter your fetch's abilities, they might wait until you activate it to interfere with the chances of it finding a land or to cast something before your mana generating land enters the battlefield. Talking about mana, the shock lands are the main source of it in this deck. Watery Grave, Blood Crypt, and Steam Vents will provide the necessary versatile mana base, while also being easy to fetch because of their 2 basic land types, being able to be brought to the battlefield at instant speed by any of the appropriate fetch lands mostly used in this deck. The most important thing to note about the shock lands, aside from their mana abilities derived from their intrinsic basic land types, is the life loss option they provide. All of them have a static ability that reads, as this enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped. Always remember, this is not a triggered ability. It is a static one that takes effect as soon as the shock land hits the battlefield and can't be responded to. Also, it's never enough to emphasize that playing lands is a special action that doesn't use the stack either. So, if your opponent wants to act before this loss of life happens, they will most likely have to do something while one of your fetch land's activated abilities are on the stack. Lastly, we have the Horizon lands, or Canopy lands, such as Fiery Islet. Though not as present as fetches or shocks, they became somewhat popular because of the less explosive but constant stream of life loss and the added card draw, when they're no longer needed as a mana generating source. As you can see on the card, this land has two abilities. The first one reads, tap and pay 1 life, add a blue or red mana. This one is a mana ability, and as such doesn't use the stack and cannot be responded to. The second is a non-mana activated ability that reads, pay 1 generic mana, tap and sacrifice this land, draw a card. This ability uses the same logic as the one on the fetches, it uses the stack and can be responded to. Now that we have a good idea of how the mana base in this deck works, let's move on to the non-creature spells. First, the artifact. Mishra's Bauble might just look like a harmless cantrip with a fake scry stapled onto it, but it is so much more. This elegant artifact allows a skilled player to gather crucial information before he can proceed to take any other actions in their turn or the opponent's one. The Bauble has an activated ability that requires tapping and sacrificing it, and allows you to look at the top card of any target's player library. Since Grixis Death Shadow is a deck that relies on protecting your threats until you can deal the final blow, the Bauble provides you with precious information as to what is on top of any library. Is the card on top of your library useless? You can shuffle it away with the effects of a fetch land, or mill it away with a Thought Scour. Do you need to know your next draw before taking a decisive action? The Bauble is there to let you predict a little bit of the future. Scared of the opponent's top deck? Take a peek with the Bauble and decide if you're safe to go all in. Do you want to disrupt that pesky combo or Tron deck? Look at the top of the library, mill their important deck pieces, and unleash a surgical extraction to destroy their hopes of getting ahead. This little artifact is a powerhouse, and to make it even better, it fills your graveyard and replaces itself on the next upkeep. Just keep some things in mind. Its activated abilities follow the same rules as the ones on the fetches, and it's a targeted one, so it will be stopped by hexproof effects such as the ones on Leyline of Sanctity. Also, the card draw trigger is not optional, so in extreme situations, like when you're playing against a mill deck, the forced card draw can lead you to an inevitable game loss by decking yourself. Now that we know how to get a little bit of information from the top of players' libraries, how about we see what's in their hands too? Next up are the hand attacks, Inquisition of Kozilek and Thoughtseize. These powerful sorceries allow you to look at your opponent's hand and then pick apart the strategies by discarding key cards that could interfere with your game plan. Hand attacks require a lot of attention when being used and after they're used to. Your opponent does not have to keep their cards revealed after you take a look at them, so if you don't have a very good memory, it might be useful to bring something like a notepad to write down the cards left in your opponent's hand after the discarding effects. Also, if the spell resolves and you take a look at target player's hand, and at least one of the revealed cards fill the requisites of the hand attack, it must be discarded as a part of the spell's effect. What this means is that if you look at your opponent's hand, and he has only lands and one of these guys, you will be forced to discard them if they can be chosen by the hand attack effect. Tough luck, friend. In some desperate situations, you might want to cast a hand attack on yourself, as a way to lose some life, or to fill your graveyard with more cards to delve. In this case, remember, you have to reveal your whole hand to the opponents, and if asked to, give them the opportunity to note the cards you have in hand, before concealing them again. Thoughtseize has a particular feature that might confuse some more unexperienced players, but it's actually pretty straightforward. The spell reads, target player reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card, you lose 2 life. Note that losing 2 life is part of the spell's effect, and not from its cost, so if by any means Thoughtseize doesn't get to resolve, you won't lose life. When you can't actually get your opponent to discard something by hitting them with a well-placed hand attack, it's always a good option to leave some mana up for the well-known counterspells. These instants are a powerful line of defense against some cards that might come in to ruin your plans of killing your opponents. Firstly, we have the tried and true Stubborn Denial, able to counter any non-creature spell unless your opponent pays 1 generic mana, or just outright countering said spell if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Please note that this card will check for the Ferocious clause as a part of its resolution, so if your opponent plays a removal or bounce spell on your only creature with power 4 or more after the Burn Denial was on the stack, it will only be a soft counter that allows the opponent to pay 1 generic mana to prevent its effect. Don't forget that abilities that trigger with the casting of some spells, like the one on the Sprite Dragon, will go on the stack on top of the spell that caused it to trigger, therefore resolving before it, and maybe enabling Ferocious as the Stubborn Denial resolves. Another powerful counterspell option used in many of the GDS lists is Drown in the Loch, a conditional hard counter that can hit any spell as long as its converted mana cost is equal to or less than the number of cards in its controller graveyard. The checking of those conditions also happens as the spell is resolving, so anyone might try to fiddle with one another's graveyard as a way to enable or disable the effects of this counterspell. As an example, your opponent can activate something like Scavenger Grounds while Drown in the Loch is on the stack to protect their spell by changing the number of cards in the graveyard. Also, it is crucial to know when a spell that has X in its mana cost is on the stack, X will be whatever value was chosen as part of the spell's casting. With that in mind, you should know that the converted mana cost of these spells on the stack will be the sum of the values of X and whatever other mana costs it might have. Sometimes, you will not be able to counter your opponent's creature spells while they're on the stack, and when that happens, you need to find tools to open the way so that your creatures can swing without interference of any blockers. That's when the creature removal spells prove their value. Grixis builds of Death Shadow decks mostly pack in spot removal spells in the main 60 cards. With that in mind, they have to be very efficient and synergistic with the rest of the deck. Let's talk again about the versatile Drown in the Loch. If you draw the spell one turn too late, or if the opponent doesn't have enough cards to outright enable its countering effect, you can save it for later, and then use it as a creature removal spell, as long as you respect the same conditions already explained on the last section. There's one catch though. Some creature spells have X in their mana cost, such as the ever-present Walking Ballista. These cards have two distinct converted mana costs depending on where they stand. If a Ballista is on the stack as a creature spell, and its controller chose 1 as the value to X, it will have a CMC of 2 until it resolves and enters the battlefield. When that happens, the values for X will be considered as 0, and its converted mana cost will now be the sum of the values in its mana cost. In this case, the total CMC of a Ballista on the battlefield will always be 0, no matter what value was chosen as it was cast. Also, when using spells that care about a creature's CMC, it's always important to remember the following. Most tokens have converted mana cost equal to 0. Creatures that copy others will have a CMC equal to the card they copied, and token copies will also follow the same rule as a regular copy. Keep that in mind, as it is relevant for both Drown in the Loch and the next spell in our guide, Fatal Push. One of the least flavorful kill spells in all of Magic, it compensates this fact by being able to kill a high percentage of the most powerful creatures in the modern format, sometimes without, and other times only with Revolt. The good thing about Revolt in a Fatal Push is that it doesn't really care what type of permanent left the battlefield, be it a land, a creature, an artifact, or even a token. All of them will satisfy the condition, no matter if they were killed, exiled, bounced, or even just blinked and came right back to the battlefield. Revolt will already be active. Another important feature about Fatal Push is that because of its wording, it can target any creature, not just the ones with converted mana cost low enough to be destroyed. That way, you might even use one of them in your own Gurmags to no effect if you know you're not gonna use them and need to fill your graveyard for any reason. Always beside Fatal Push is the Fearsome Dismember, a spell that uses the overpowered Phyrexian mana to shrink any creature by -5/-5 until the end of the turn. Because of its uncommon mana cost, it's important to clarify the following. Dismember is always considered to be a black spell under normal circumstances, even if you paid no actual black mana to cast it, by paying 1 generic mana and 4 life. Its converted mana cost is always equal to 3, and You choose how to pay for each fraction mana cost symbol at the same time you would choose a value to X. This spot removal is especially powerful in this deck because it can remove a threat, be it a blocker or attacker, and also increase the power of shadows and scourges by however much life you chose to pay when you're casting it. This life loss can't be responded to because it is a part of the casting cost of the spell. That way, the opponent will have to deal with your threats with however much power and toughness they get after you cast Dismember. Just remember, you can pay 2 life if you have 1 or less of it. A well-known but still important piece of information is that Dismember can be used to kill indestructible creatures. That is possible because one of the state-based actions in the game reads as follows. If a creature has toughness 0 or less, it's put into its owner graveyard. Regeneration can't replace this event. Note that it doesn't destroy the creature, it simply puts it directly into its owner graveyard. That's why you can even dismember gods, as long as you can get them to 0 or less toughness. The last spell in our removal category is the Swiss Army knife known as Callaghan's Command. The usual issues with this card come up because it is a modal spell with 4 different modes, and because you can choose 2 different modes when casting it. In short, the rulings for this spell can be but like this. You choose 2 different modes as you cast the spell. They can't be changed later. All of the spell's modes are targeted. That means you can only choose a mode if you have a legal target for it as you're casting the spell. The modes that were not chosen do not influence in anything when it comes to targeting restrictions. The modes will resolve in the order they are written, and if the spell is copied, the copy will have the same modes as the original one. If the copy effect says you can choose other targets, you can do so as you please, so long as these targets are legal. The spell will not resolve if all of its targets become illegal, and if at least one target is still legal, the spell will resolve, but with no effect on any illegal target. Last but not least, we have the spells that enable a lot of the strategies in this deck, by either accelerating the timing when you can play your most powerful threats, amplifying the potential of dealing a killing blow, or by covering big flaws that might be exploited by your opponents. Let's take a look at those utility spells. First on our list is a simple instant cantrip. Thought Scour does not have much mystery to it. You first choose a target player, then, if by the time the spell resolves that player is still a legal target, they will put the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, and then you, the caster of Thought Scour, will draw a card, always in that order. This spell has a lot of different uses, but its main one is to serve as an accelerator for a quick Gurmag Angler or Tazager, enabling those powerful threats as soon as turn 2. And don't forget that, if you know your opponent's library's top card, you can try to target them with Thought Scour if such card is a threat you cannot respond in any other way, or you can try to starve them if you see they're struggling to hit some land drops. Always be creative with this spell, and don't forget that even if you don't have a Gurmag to cast, you can put some key spells in your own graveyard to enable some flashbacks in a pinch. Moving on, we have Cling to Dust, a much welcome addition to DDS decks in a meta that cares so much about the graveyard. It also provides crucial main deck life gain, since Grixis builds tend to hurt themselves really hard on the early turns, and sometimes will lose by a small margin if the opponent can hit a single well-timed direct damage spell or attack. Because Escape is a common mechanic from Theros Beyond Death, we will not be covering how it works here. Just remember that the converted mana cost of this spell remains the same, even if you cast it for its escape cost, and it goes back to the graveyard after it resolves by escape. Note that the effect clauses of this card are excluded, meaning you can't get both effects if you exile a card from a graveyard that is a creature and some other non-creature type, like an artifact creature. You either gain 3 life by exiling any kind of creature card, or you draw a card if you exile anything else. And as most single targeted spells, if its target becomes illegal as it resolves, it will have no effect. Now, because of the order things happen when you're casting a spell, you can actually target one of the 5 cards you exile as you escape Cling to Dust. This will result in a successful cast, but the spell won't resolve, it will simply go back to your graveyard. This is possible because you first declare the targets for a spell, and then if all the targets are legal, you pay its casting cost. In this case, 3 generic and 1 black mana, and exiling 5 cards from your graveyard, one of which happens to be Clings to Dust's target. The only uses I can see for this interaction is to either clear your graveyard or trigger effects that only care about the casting part of the spell, such as the one on Sprite Dragon, meaning you can use this trick to get that last 1 point of damage needed by giving your creature a +1/+1 counter. Finally, we've come to the last spell on this list, the beautiful finisher that is Steamer Battle Rage. This red instant gives any target creature double strike until the end of the turn, adding a bonus trample effect that also lasts until the end of the turn if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Just like its counterspell cousin, this spell will check for the Ferocious Claws as it's resolving, interacting in the same way Stubborn Denial does with creatures that can buff themselves before the spell resolves. Remember, the target creature gains trample even if it doesn't have power 4 or greater, so long as any other creature you control has such power. And since it can target any creature, not just the ones you control, you can use it to kill stuff like Phantasmal Image, or take some extra damage quickly by targeting one of your opponent's attacking creatures, to enable things like making your shadow bigger in the first strike phase and allowing some surprise trades while blocking. Or maybe you just want to lose a bunch of life if you want to live on the edge, because the shadow of the candle looms tall, even as its light grows dim. That's it for this video. I would really love if any of you would leave some feedback about the stuff here, especially if it had some information you previously didn't know about. Also, feel free to point out anything wrong or any explanations you might disagree. The whole purpose of these videos is to bring information to people who mostly play tabletop Magic. It will also mean the world if you could like the video or subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Good luck and have fun, fellow Magic players.